that the nervousness that my lecture might fall short of the scholarship displayed earlier on this occasion by my predecessors, and the second reason that I'm slightly fearful, is the fact that I'm going to speak on a theme which is widely referred to, invested with great transformative powers, but inadequately studied in the field of Indian history, and that is demography. So whenever we write anything on Indian history, whether it's on social history, economic history, there's a mandatory chapter or at least some references to population increase, the census said so much, or some occupational changes. So these are certain mandatory references that every research student would make. But usually it stops at that. So I have titled my lecture, Historical Demography of Modern India, A View from the Periphery. The subtitle following the colon is important because of the unfortunate neglect of demography in mainstream Indian historical writings and the subordinate significance attributed to historical processes by mainstream demographic research, and also because the original habitat of historical demography has been the Western world. When we talk about historical demography, immediately France comes to mind, or Britain comes to mind. So in the first part, I'll just look very briefly at a kind of a potted history of historiography of historical demography as it developed. And then we'll come to some of the theories and then come to India. Historical demography was studied as a subfield of economic history on the one hand, and past demographic data was used by mainstream historians to prove many of their hypotheses. The decline and the recent return of economic history globally and in India has been frequently commented upon and does not require reiteration here. I think Aditya also spoke about the dying species, but I think like a phoenix, it refuses to die. So that's the good thing about economic history. And whenever we have a severe crisis, that's when economic history people start thinking that, yes, we should study the economy, not just culture and text and things of that sort. You should study all that, but you should also study this. So I'm not going to go into this, the decline and the regrowth or renewed interest in economic history here. What is pertinent to this paper is the fact that even in the heyday of economic history in India, historical demography did not develop beyond rudimentary estimations of population sizes and changes in occupational distributions in modern Indian historiography. While demography is essentially a discipline of the historical present, dealing with propelling demographic change in desired directions at desired speeds in the future, historical demography, like history, attempts to unravel the past of those processes that are of significance to the historical present. Because when I was driving down to this place, there was a lorry in front of me, a truck in front of me, which said, "Hamare do, hamara ek," which, if you remember the older days, it was not ek, it was do, and before do, it was teen. So demography mainstream demography wants you to take demographic processes in a particular direction at particular decided speeds decided by policymakers. Whereas historical demography is different from this. It looks at the past of these processes. So my presentation today is an attempt to make the case for paying greater attention to historical demography, a subdiscipline dealing with the most basic processes of human life that has the potential to intervene in many of the long-standing debates in Indian history and in history elsewhere also. So it's divided into three sections. I'll start with section 1, which is the development of historical demography. Please excuse me if this is well known to the audience here. The birth of historical demography can be dated exactly to 1 year, to 1958, when French scholars applied the new method of family reconstitution to nominative records. Pierre Goubet, who was associating with this French demographer called Louis Henry, Pierre Goubet, the economic historian interested in subsistence crisis, and Louis Henry, who was trying to determine levels and patterns of natural fertility, collaborated to create this new field of social scientific research. The publication of the research on the village of Crouly in Normandy showed how detailed demographic information about age-specific mortality, fertility, and nuptiality could be collected from parish registers much before census and registration figures became available. Louis Henry, the demographer, hoped that by subjecting the reconstituted families to rigorous scientific investigation, the true laws, and there's a quotation actually, the true laws of population valid over long periods in time could be discovered. However, Goubet, the economic historian, remained unconvinced. He was quite skeptical of having these true laws over long periods of time being established once and for all. Goubet's skepticism of Henry's hope of discovering long-run laws discounting historical context continues to be shared by historians when claims are made by social scientists for time-invariant social models. Now, this is not to do only with historical demography. It applies very well to many kinds of economics or sociology or anthropology also. Anyway, soon after Henry's study of Crouly, English scholars followed suit with the establishment of the Cambridge Group for the history of population and social structure at Cambridge in 1964. Please do not confuse the Cambridge Group with the Cambridge School, okay? Yeah. They are quite different. English historical demography under the auspices of the Cambridge Group went beyond family reconstitution and the study of short-run time series of prices and wages in the French tradition. The Cambridge Group studied the homeostatic nature of demographic regimes and went on to explore the Malthusian preventive check, which in turn led them to study the household and the family. So there are references in the paper. Look at Peter Laslett, one of the names which would be familiar to students. The Cambridge Group also made important technical contributions in the form of back projection, overcoming the slowness and tediousness of family reconstitution. This method permitted linking of baptism, marriages, and burials to later census data to yield aggregative demographic measures for the earlier period, exploiting the mathematical principle of weak ergodicity. Historical demography, however, has not been restricted to France and England. Scandinavia, Holland, Italy, Germany, Poland, Romania, Czechoslovakia, all of them produced significant research in this field subsequently. In the non-European world, demographers working on China and Japan have taken the lead in analyzing new sources, namely genealogies in demographic and social economic reconstruction. Genealogies were used on a very large scale by historical demographers working on China. The mortality decline in Europe, the causes for 19th century population increase, economy demography interactions, nuptiality, fertility control, and institutional correlates of demographic change are some of the well-researched subjects of Western historical demography. Now, in the 1960s, there was a Princeton-based European fertility project which studied aggregate data to test some of the main theories of demography. One, fortunately, demography didn't have many theories. So what they call theories, one of the things that they call theories is more of a descriptive model, but it's been called the demographic transition theory, the class. So the demographic transition theory the demographic transition theory said that first you will have high fertility and high mortality and population will not increase. In the second phase, you'll have falling mortality and fertility remains high, leading to increase in population. And in the third phase, you will have mortality continues to fall, but fertility falls even faster, leading to a slow, gradual contraction of population. So this is a global tripartite division of historical change in the change. This was known as the classical transition theory. I'll come to it in a moment. So the Princeton scholars tried to see whether this actually held or not. Now, whether this could be actually validated or not. In order to do so, they looked at historical data from Europe. So that was the 1960s European Fertility Project, which went back to historical data in order to validate current demographic theories. Demography received some of its basic operational categories, such as natural fertility and the demographic transition, from historical demographic exercises. Historical demography also became crucial in the testing of large theories of modern demography, the other large theory being the Malthusian laws of population change. So history played a very important role in testing these two theories. One, Malthus's long-run theory of population change, and the tripartite demographic transition theory. Malthus's main contribution was to enunciate a homeostatic cyclical view of population movements. Population outstripping food supply leading to crisis could be averted by the preventive check in the form of postponed or averted marriages in the civilized European West. Actually, he says the civilized Christian European West, with others condemned to the so-called positive check that took the form of war, disease, sterility from sexually transmitted diseases, polygamy, and vices including infanticide, abortion, and contraception. Remember, Malthus was a believing Christian and therefore he was against contraception. The general Malthusian model, with its claim of universal applicability, was characterized by an unchanging or balanced, self-balancing or homeostatic population economy equilibrium via the operation of the preventive or the positive check. And this made it very easy to understand and made it popular across countries, including India. Along with this, the class anxiety in Malthusian writings made it politically significant, and one of the direct outcomes was the Poor Law Amendment of 1834, whereby outdoor relief was substituted by urban workhouses in Britain. Malthusian anxiety to control population appealed to a wide range of groups in India. A striking parallel to the Malthusian opposition to English poor laws was the famine relief measures in India. As India was being ravaged by deadly famines, the Governor-General Lord Lytton was of the view that famines resulted from the fact that the Indian population has a tendency to increase more rapidly than the food it raises from the soil. So taken straight from Malthus. Successive census commissioners up to 1951 emphasized the Malthusian danger of overpopulation. The need for government intervention in terms of family planning was raised as early as 1931. You find references to this in the 31 census. These recommendations were repeated by the Indian Famine Inquiry Commission of 1945 that investigated the Bengal famine, and in the following year by the Joseph Bohr Committee's study on India's health requirements. Now, even before the coming of independence, Indians ranging from the radical Jawaharlal Nehru, the Congress's National Planning Committee, the Eugenics Association, the Maharaja of Mysore, were all convinced of the need to reduce the population in India if the country had to develop. So we see how this idea of overpopulation catches on to a wide range of, people get influenced by it. This state of demographic thinking in India at the time of independence very neatly dovetailed into post-war United States prescriptions for development in the Third World in a context defined by America's growing worry at communist expansion. The so-called transition theory, which was first presented in 1929 by Warren S. Thompson and restated in 1944 by Notstein and Kingsley Davis. Kingsley Davis, I'm sure many of the students here would have read Davis's book on the population of India and Pakistan. By Notstein and Kingsley Davis to become the guiding theory of demographic change. In this evolutionary and functionalist model of fertility decline was necessarily consequent upon industrialization and modernization. Within a space of just about half a decade, alarmed by the expansion of the communists or the spread of the communist movement, Notstein and subsequently Davis revised their recently pronounced model of demographic change, because they are coming out with this restated model right at the end of the war. Soon after that, they within about less than 10 years, they change. And they say that they revised their recently pronounced model of demographic change very significantly, seeing fertility control as a necessary condition for long-term control of fertility. Earlier they said that fertility control contraception could be there, but it is only an ameliorative. You have to bring about industrialized modern economic development, industrialization, to reduce fertility in the long run. But if you read the literature, it's very interesting. It happens, all these people are on a trip to China. And when they are in China, there's a major battle which is won by Mao. The communists still haven't come to power, but after this battle, it is very clear that the communists are going to come to power. So when Irene Tauber, Davis, all of them come back to the United States, there is a restatement of the demographic transition theory. The immediate goal of American demographers was to convince Third World leadership that population control was both possible and necessary, and they found receptive takers in the form of the Indian government. So, and you have a large number of, soon after the war, you have population research centers coming up across India, one being in Delhi University, in the Institute of Economic Growth, you have one in Bangalore, one in Bombay, it's across. And all of them are doing surveys to find out about knowledge, practice of KPP surveys of contraception. Now, one surprising lacuna in the intellectual history of demography has been the failure to take note of Karl Marx's observation that there was no one universal law of population. Unfortunately, this warning has not been heeded by the Marxists themselves. Now, Robert Brenner had argued in this debate, and I quote, "It is the structure of class relations, of class power, which will determine the manner and the degree to which particular demographic changes will affect long-run trends in the distribution of income and economic growth, and not vice versa." So clearly it says that demographic change is secondary to economic growth and changes in class relations. It seems as though this hesitancy to concede the explanatory potential of demographic change on the part of modern-day Marxists stems from their tendency to extrapolate retrospectively the Marx versus Malthus polemics. In Capital I, in the first volume of Capital, Marx wrote, and I quote, "In fact, every historic mode of production has its own special laws of population, historically valid within its limits only," unquote. So the context is forgotten, both by the context being important to how important or how unimportant the demographic variable is very often forgotten by Marxists as well as by non-Marxists. While rejecting Malthus for his assumption of unchanging technology and a simplistic belief in population outstripping food supply leading to crisis mortality, it must be remembered that in pre-capitalist economies, the bulk of the population lived very close to subsistence. Any adverse event or combination of events threatening that delicate balance could lead to significant excess deaths and reduced births and delayed marriages. But these shocks always acted via existing institutions and configurations of social power. Therefore, the demographic consequences of drought and disease were always socially mediated. At the same time, social arrangements, despite their variations, made some groups more demographically vulnerable to high mortality, morbidity, and even fertility. Now I come to India, and it's a very, very brief survey because the organizers had very brutally put a limit of, I think, 5,000 words, including footnotes or something. So much of what Irfan Saab and what Professor Shireen Musfi has written on occupational structure is not here because I was asked by her not to exceed. So it is just confined to modern India. Otherwise, it would be interesting to look at how medieval historians have looked at the demographic variable. Now, coming to India, we find that till the 1970s, all research publications on the demographic past of India dealt with estimating population sizes for different parts of the country at various points in time. Since Moreland's publication of India, The Death of Akbar, a number of scholars have speculated on the size of the population for different parts and for the country as a whole. The first and only comprehensive work on Indian historical demography is Kingsley Davis's Population of India and Pakistan, which was published as far back as 1951, and it is based entirely on census data. And Kingsley Davis writes his book without ever seeing India. He never sets foot in India. Davis's book is at its weakest when it comments on non-demographic influences on population change. For instance, despite the evidence of increasing mortality in the late 19th century, he goes on to write, and I quote, "During the 19th century, when the effects of peace and order were being felt, there was a general impression that India's population was growing fairly rapidly, a fact which was apparently not true in previous centuries." Davis again betrays remarkable faith in the benign impact of British colonialism in India. The first effect of European control in India was to lessen warfare and banditry, and later to reduce famine and disease. Without this outside stimulus, it is doubtful if India's condition would have changed for several centuries. Unquote. This is a quote from Davis. Further, Davis's explanation for the control of famines was the development of roads, railways, and irrigation by the British. Modern medical advances are argued to have checked epidemic diseases. To explain the reduction of famine mortality and intensity in terms of irrigation is questionable. In the first 43 years of the 20th century, the country remained free of any major famine. However, the percentage of irrigated area to total cultivated area increased only marginally from 20% in 1901 to 23% in 1930. Improvement in communications is also an inadequate explanation for controlling famines. Better communications can theoretically reduce the risk of famine and intensity by ensuring more stable food supplies. But if there are more stable food supplies, it should reflect in terms of food prices being more stable. However, famines recurred repeatedly in the years up to 1900. For the period 1865 to 1900, the coefficient of variation in the prices of wheat and rice fell from more than 40% to nearly 20%. So if this massive decrease in price variation could not prevent famines, it is difficult to argue that a subsequent fall in this index by just about 5% could lead to the stopping of famines, or nearly, other than the Bengal famine. Now, after Davis, we find that there are demographers who wrote on on matters which had a bearing on Indian historical demography. One was a monograph by Sudhanshu Bhushan Mukherjee on the age structure of the Indian population, once again based on census data. And then there is a compilation of information by Leela and Praveen Visaria's contribution to the Cambridge Economic History of India, Volume 2. So part of it was based on Leela's own research. And here again, we find that despite collating and describing the main sources of Indian historical demography, the contribution is limited by an absence of rigorous connections between demographic trends and historical developments. For instance, the slow rate of population increase up to 1921 is ascribed to high mortality that was primarily related to waves of epidemics. What remains unexplained is why these diseases suddenly lose their lethal power in the 1920s. Again, political stability under British rule is offered as one of the explanations for faster population growth in the period 1800 to 1850 compared with the preceding 50 years. It's largely taken from Kingsley Davis's explanations. If this indeed was the case, then we should find the rate of growth accelerating in the years between 1850 and 1871, which it didn't, despite the fall in diseases. Because this is also the time when Pax Britannica really struck deep roots in India. And that is the time when you have massive excess mortality. The next important publication was a collection of articles by Tim Dyson. Dyson's volume investigated Indian historical demography using standard tools of technical demography and using vital registration as a source for the first time. Because till now, everybody had depended only on the census. Tim Dyson and some of the others contributors used registration data, which is annual or even monthly. So, as a historian, we are happy when we get data which is much more granular in nature. So, this was one of the major contributions. What he does is they use standard demographic techniques and apply it to Indian historical data, including annual serial historical data. After the publication of Dyson's volume, a number of articles were published on various aspects of the country's demographic past that went beyond mere estimation of population size. New sources were brought into use. Accepted explanations of demographic change were questioned. Standard demographic techniques were used to study historical data. A few of the works on Indian demography have incorporated the past in the analysis of contemporary issues. Examples being Monica Dasgupta's work on fertility transition in Punjab, K.S. James' piece on Kerala, where these are mainstream demographers who sensitively used historical information in trying to understand the issues at hand. Demographic changes have now begun to be seriously considered as reliable evidence for social impact of political and economic policies. By implication, demographic events and processes which were earlier imagined as natural or simply a function of modernization are contextualized. Amartya Sen used the Bengal famine of 1943 as a case study to dispute the food availability decline and to emphasize the socially uneven collapse of entitlements and state institutions as explanations of famine. Amiya Bagchi has highlighted the need to study many aspects of demographic change in economic history as specific processes embedded in historically determinate and changing production regimes. Modern Indian history, or the history of colonial India, has been one of the most vibrant areas of historical research in India. For some decades now, social history, displacing the earlier dominance of economic history, has been in the ascendant. However, social historians of India have paid scant attention to demographic processes of the past. Much has been written on culture, on cities, on urbanization, but very, very basic processes such as births, deaths, marriages, childbirth, contraception, family history, migration have largely escaped the interest of the Indian social historian. Yes, there are novels written on migration, there are articles written on a text based on migration, but when it is being written without much reference to the demographic sources, available demographic sources on any of these areas. Now I come to the last section, which is, do I have 10 minutes? Yes. Historical demography in the service of modern Indian history. In this section, I draw upon my own research on the historical demography of southern India and that of other scholars to show how this subfield has questioned accepted large theories and how it can be used fruitfully to contribute to some of the major debates in modern Indian historiography. First, a brief note on the sources. Demography cannot be studied without some minimum quantitative information on population, births, marriages, deaths, migration, preferably in the form of time series. Such information became regularly available in largely comparable form with the decennial All India censuses beginning in 1871-72, and most scholars have used the source disregarding other more difficult to find sources. One of the problems with census data is that it is available only once in 10 years. Historians are interested in events and conjunctures requiring temporally more granular data. Indian historical demographers have shown how, after careful corrections, the colonial vital registration data can be fruitfully utilized to study monthly and annual patterns of demographic change in association with relevant economic, political, and meteorological covariates. A similar important source, limited to pockets of Christian population in some parts of India, are parish registers. Only very little work has yet been done on the source, and if somebody is ready to spend some time in different churches, they have to go to each individual church. There is a wealth of information that is there and which can be used. And this will tell you help you reconstruct a social history of when did women, marriage practices, when do they get married. I mean, we are not taking one character from a story, we are talking about large aggregates, the age at first marriage, or number of children, the interval between childbearing, mortality, diseases, and you can even get other data on, for instance, the parish registers often tell you about what is your occupation. So, does the carpenter have as many children as the trader? Or does the landlord and the agricultural worker, even caste is there in Indian parish registers? Because many of them usually caste, because if you look at the early parish registers, they will tell you of the caste that you're converting from. So it takes some convincing, but once you convince the church authorities, they usually let you have it, but it asks you to keep it confidential. So you can keep individual data confidential, but at the same time, it's a mine of historical information that awaits anybody who's interested in the form of parish registers. For instance, Kerala has it, Goa has it. Unfortunately, Delhi and so on do not have it because the Christian populations are very small, and the records were also, they got lost at the time of partition. So, but Goa, Kerala, I don't know about the Northeast. Uttarakhand will again have, where you have a colonial civil station or a military station, you will have it. But it becomes more interesting when you have large parts which are representative of the Indian population who can be found in these records. The other problem with these records is you find it in Bombay, you find it in Pondicherry, but these are bad places to do this analysis. Why? Because a lot of people are coming into Bombay and a lot of people are leaving Bombay. So you cannot trace a family. So this is called the problem of leavers and stayers. you don't want too many levers. So this is a very, very important source that can be used. It has been used by some historians. In fact, K.S. James has used it for Kerala. Irudaya Rajan used it for Bombay, but Bombay has this problem which I just told you about. So it can be used, and you can bring all these techniques which have been developed in France and in Britain to analyze this material. Now, let us first see how Indian historical demography has challenged some of the guiding principles of mainstream demography and economic thinking. Indian historical demographic evidence has clearly refuted the Malthusian claim of overpopulation leading to excess mortality, and the claim that the preventive or prudential check was practiced only by the advanced Christian West. Between 1871 and 1921, the population of colonial India grew at an annual average rate of 0.37%, while during 1921-41, the rate of growth of population sharply increased to 1.22%. However, India was racked by a series of frequent and deadly famines when population growth was very slow. And it starts declining when population growth became quicker. Again, controverting the Malthusian claim, it was precisely when the agrarian frontier was rapidly expanding that episodes of famine mortality were most frequent and deadly. Secondly, the preventive check in the form of averted or delayed marriages was widely evidenced in 19th and early 20th century southern India, thereby denying the West any exclusive claim over this form of fertility control. The Brahmanical proscription of widow remarriage also served to avert births in many parts of the country. Further, in some places, the so-called positive check and the preventive check worked together. It wasn't as if you have the positive check, if you have the preventive check, the positive check is not significant. Or if you have the positive check, then the preventive check is not powerful enough. Both are seen to have worked together, especially in the Deccan districts of the old Madras presidency. After 1921, there is a pervasive improvement in mortality across the Indian subcontinent. The exact timing of the sustained fall in mortality did vary, but mortality had begun to decline after the influenza pandemic of 1918. In the absence of any real welfarist state intervention, colonial Indian demographic processes were largely, within quotes, natural. The deadly triad of monsoon failure, profit-driven market forces, and diseases continued to severely limit Indian life expectancy till the second decade of the 20th century. Only when this lethal concatenation was broken did mortality begin to decline in India. Colonial health and other public welfare policies had no ameliorative impact on mortality levels. And I say this without any riders. The question then is, why did the death rate fall? In a context where the state did little to make any substantial improvements in the lives of ordinary Indians. The colonial government of India was firmly wedded to maintaining a balanced budget and had very little funds to spare for public welfare. And this, for many of us it is well known. Some people might argue against it. The per capita spending under the head of medicine and health was most meager, amounting to rupees 0.07, 0.14, 0.11 in 1900, 01, 1920, 21, and 1930, 31. So, which in a way means that virtually nothing was spent. And health expenditure increases only in 1946-47 do we find the expenditure increasing to 44.69 rupees. Now, it is pertinent to recall that Sir Joseph Bose's report published in 1946 estimated that there were only 6,000 beds available for about 2.5 million patients in India. In other words, most Indians died without seeing the inside of a hospital in colonial India. So this story about, there's a lot of work on medicine these days. But this medicine, somehow, this Western medicine, modern medicine, just doesn't get to the ordinary person. Ira Klein, discounting the state's role in attenuating high levels of mortality in India, argued for a more epidemiological thesis to explain falling death rates in India. However, there is no available evidence in Indian historical demography to posit such a connection. Spelling error, it's not Sumit. Sumit Guha has clearly shown the lack of empirical basis for Klein's thesis. However, Guha then goes on to argue that reduction in the volatility of Indian food output, which in turn was determined by more timely and adequate rains, explain India's falling mortality. This argument is correct per se. While per capita food output decreased in the post-First World War period before 1947, so did the coefficient of variation in the food output series. That is, the fluctuations, although there is a secular decline, the fluctuations become attenuated. What this implied was that, although there was slightly less food to eat, the marked fluctuations declined. This reduced mortality, especially crisis mortality. Agricultural output and rainfall variation data do show a declining trend from the 1920s to the 1940s. Guha's contention that increased stability in food output, despite stagnation and decline, lowered mortality is plausible. However, it is more difficult to posit a direct, simple correlation between variations in the quantum of rainfall and output fluctuations. Even agriculture that is entirely monsoon dependent is affected not only by the variations in the quantum of rainfall, but is also very significantly impacted by the timing of the onset of monsoons and rainfall distribution across the monsoon months. This part of Guha's argument needs further substantiation. At the moment, the agricultural output-driven mortality decline thesis, though partial, appears to be the most plausible explanation for the riddle of India's population mortality decline. Here we add to this thesis by arguing that along with an increased stability in food availability, the Depression also witnessed a fall in the inequality of landholding in most of the study districts being the districts selected wet districts and dry districts of old Madras Presidency. So here we find, and David Ladden writes, uniquely in Kerala, Tamil Nadu and Karnataka, trends and patterns of inequality in landholding spanning richer and poorer regions have favored populous middle and lower castes. Though the Depression in India certainly did not benefit agriculture in terms of economic returns or productivity, with a swelling in the numbers of poor cultivators who got access to land in a context of falling food prices and the flight of the wealthier farmers from agriculture, it is possible that their attempts to stave off hunger improved somewhat. This possibility needs to be studied in greater detail to understand mortality decline in India. I have shown this for selected districts of Madras Presidency, but it has to be done on a much larger scale for it to be a more significant alternative thesis. It also supports the assertion that demographic change is not natural and exogenous, but it is related to socially specific patterns of expanded reproduction of labor. The demographic histories of southern India, especially its record of fertility when aggregated over the long term, stands out in clear distinction from the rest of India. However, on exploring further, this large putative South Indian pattern dissolves into more than one trajectory of change, trajectories that were premised on varied production processes, existing attitudes to marriage, class configurations, and varying interventional capabilities of the developmental state in the years after independence. Specific intersections of the conjunctural and the long term speeded up fertility decline in some regions, whereas its absence precluded any such spectacular transformation in others. So here I have contrasted the wet and the dry districts of southern India, of old Madras Presidency, which form most of southern India, and showed the different trajectories of demographic change. Secondly, the age at first marriage in southern India, though low by Western standards, was much higher than the mean age at marriage for the country as a whole. This north-south difference comes across as a demographic characteristic of long-standing, going at least as far back as the late 19th century. The demographic behavior of the famine and crisis mortality-prone dry Deccan districts of southern India contradicts the neat Malthusian spatial and temporal division between, which I mentioned earlier, between the positive and the preventive checks. The Deccan and even late 19th century Malabar, despite frequent mortality peaks, regulated nuptiality by ensuring that a large proportion of their population in the reproductive ages remained unmarried. The existence of such fertility-reducing practices amongst the dominant castes in the pre-mortality and fertility decline period in some of the districts appears to have facilitated early parity-dependent control in the 20th century. So it has a kind of a path-dependent characteristic to it. When mortality declined and population began to increase rapidly, and modern means of contraception became available. So places where there was some kind of fertility control accepted these modern methods of contraception and fertility control much more easily and much more quickly. After 1947, the welfarist state intervention in the countryside increased to unprecedented levels. For India, government spending on health and education per capita increased from an average of 0.67 in 1900-01 and 1930-31 to 5.5, 16.2, 86.3 and 189.5 through between the first and the seventh five-year plans, with health expenditure peaking in the 1980s. If we look at the percentage of total state expenditure, total state government expenditure devoted to health, we find that the southern states of Kerala and Tamil Nadu, the pioneers in achieving low fertility, were not the highest ranking states in terms of spending on health. Welfare schemes performed dismally in precisely those regions of the country where traditional structures of power based on landlordism and caste held sway without significant challenge and change. Although more money was spent in many other parts of India, where earlier forms of landlordism and caste control could not be challenged, it didn't have any very beneficial health outcomes. Once again, we see that the level of mortality and the stability or lack of it, captured by the coefficient of variation in the crude death rate, in the pre-transitional demographic regime played a major role in determining the timing of the later fertility transition. Broadly, famine districts characterized by high and fluctuating mortality accomplished the fertility transition later than agriculturally and economically more secure regions. Finally, the demographic record, especially population growth rates and mortality, can be used to intervene in some of the long-standing debates in modern Indian history. Reference has already been made to the conclusive evidence that colonial rule did not, for the most part, bring about any improvement in survival chances for Indians. The deindustrialization debate based on census occupational data is well known and does not require recapitulation. It's one place where conventional census-based demographic data has been used very fruitfully. The revisionist scholarship on the 18th century in Indian history has largely argued its case from the vantage point of the market to argue for a seamless, within quotes, transition to colonialism. I've heard of transition from feudalism to capitalism, but now we are told that there was something akin called a transition to colonialism, with a progressive expansion of commercial activities. Expanding commerce is put forward as a proxy for more general economic growth. If indeed there was such pervasive economic growth, this should have resulted in bettering human survival and consequently population size. However, the demographic record of abrupt depopulation, deserted villages, increased frequency of devastating famines, and slow population growth, evidence for which is available from different parts of the subcontinent, goes against this view of progressive economic development and suggests a violent rupture that spanned the late 18th and early 19th centuries. I end with another example taken from the end of colonial rule and the beginning decades of independence. Life expectancy in India continued its post-1921 path of secular increase, improving markedly during 51-61. However, these gains in mortality had to wait for another 2 decades to result in changes in fertility. As adequate improvements in infant and child mortality, health delivery, education, and wages persisted in being geographically very skewed and exhibited long-run continuities. The historical demography of post-independent India faithfully mirrors the varied development trajectories of the different parts of India and the incompleteness of the development project. So, for historians some historians are scared of numbers, I will end by saying demographic history should always start with numbers but should never end with numbers. For this preferred goal to be achieved, we hope that in the future, demography becomes more historical and history sheds its distrust of numbers and begins to inquire into demography as an endogenous and socially mediated variable in historical change. Thank you.
Before Professor Gopinath begins the session and the reading of papers, etc., he's kindly agreed to take a few questions, comments on his paper. If anybody wants to raise any question, you're most welcome. Doesn't matter, we always break precedents. That's good. If anybody wants to raise a question, you're most welcome.
Sorry? Yes. Because all the census reports are available in the US. In fact, they have much better records in Britain of registration data than you have in the National Archives. The National Archives stops in 1921. London School of Economics has the entire series, and census data is available everywhere. So, I can't hear. Madam, I can't hear you.
Can you come up and speak, please?
Is there a mic somewhere?
There is no mic.
Well, as she comes down, let me make an announcement that immediately after this, we will continue in this very hall till 1:30. And after lunch, we will go to the academic halls. Okay. Yes, I can hear you from there. Yes, tell me. Yes. No, Indians had set up the society because the eugenics movement, as it became very popular in Europe, some Indians also started taking an interest. Lady Rama Rao. Then we also had the Planned Parenthood Association. So all these things are being taken up in India by Indians after hearing about its development in Europe, and they feel that this can be productively, these ideas, these techniques can be applied to India with beneficial consequences. Yes. Of? Yes. Yes, yes. It's not textually, you will have to quantitatively analyze in terms of life course studies. Because here you have the entire life course. From the time you are born, you are marked in the register. Then, if you die soon after, you will again be marked in the burial register. But if you don't die soon enough, you might get married. So you will be there in the marriage register, and finally you will end up in the death register or the burial register. So, how many children are born? Frequency of birth. Are these people being educated? Are the relations educated? Because the French have done a lot of work on godparents. Because the godparents, can they write? Are they literate? So, then from what radius of area are people coming for the baptism? All this is recorded. So, the social history, not just of childhood, but of the family, of these life processes, this forms a very, very important base for that.
That's all.
That's,
Thank you.
thank you. So, we will start with
This is the,
You will just start the thing. We'll start the thing.
yes, we can start.
Okay. The reading of papers will now begin. Professor Gopinath will chair.
please don't tell nobody except the organizers. This is the list of papers.
So, we go in this, we go in this order. Okay, the first lot of papers is Princely States. Princely States. The first paper is by Pradeep Kumar Deepak. Is Pradeep Kumar Deepak here? No. The next one is H. Munavarjan and M. Siddiq Ahmed. Are they here? No. Third is by Shahina Bano. Is Shahina Bano here? Fourth is by Sharmila Srivastava. Please come. Yes, yes. No, my pen is there. 15 minutes? Sharmila's paper is Paris Coffee Contract from Monopoly to Free Trade in Mysore.
Yeah, thank you. Paris Coffee Contract, 1823 to 1837, from monopoly to free trade in Mysore. Coffee, a pre-colonial peasant crop of Mysore, entered its commercial and plantation phase with British domination over the state in the 19th century. Coffee was cultivated to a very small extent at the beginning of the 19th century.
You have a paper?
Yeah,
Yeah. But I had submitted it. Here it is. Should I continue? Okay. Coffee was cultivated to a very small extent at the beginning of the 19th century in the Malnad region of Nagar division of Mysore state. The first phase of expansion of coffee cultivation and trade is associated with the farming out of Varam, that is half the crop share entitled to the Mysore government, collection to Messrs. Parry, Dare and Company, a European agency house of Madras from 1823 to 1837. This was the period of ijara dari or revenue farming in coffee, and this connection was a manifestation of globalization as Parry catered to the European market. Generally, we see that revenue farming is seen within the binary of either engendering development or exploitation of the local agrarian economy. This paper argues that in Mysore, the phase of ijaradari was initially conducive and beneficial to coffee cultivation, and after some years restrictive and oppressive to coffee cultivation. And the workings of the ijaradari and mechanisms of control, and the two mechanisms of control that I look at are the advanced system and the pass system or the rahadari system, how they helped in initially benefiting development of coffee cultivation and then restricting it. We see that the farming out of the revenue by the Mysore Maharaja in 1823 can be associated with the inability of the native government to collect tax on its own and pressures of colonialism. And the Parry's involvement with coffee is the first European example of involvement both in cultivation as well as in trade. And Parry, Dare and Company also established plantations in Mysore, and therefore it can be seen as an intermediate stage between pre-colonial native peasant cultivation and establishment of European coffee plantations. So we have 15 years of ijara dari in Mysore coffee, and the firm operated through its intermediaries, both European as well as native agents, and Parry's contract was utilized to stimulate and expand coffee cultivation in Mysore. And we are told that native agents encouraged this lucrative branch of agriculture by lending funds to ryots, which was repayable after the plants came into bearing. These advances were used by the ryots to start or expand coffee plantations and pay their annual kists on other crops and to pay off the merchants. And we see that the company had the right to collect half of the crop, as its share, but soon it started buying the second half also, and it established what has been called a virtual monopoly over procurement of coffee produced from Mysore. And this virtual monopoly was helped, because they gave advances for cultivation, and also because, they controlled the movement of coffee from the coffee producing taluks through the rahadari or the pass system. We are told that written agreements were signed between the ryots as well as the coffee department of Parry's, and very, very small quantities of coffee, that is 1 seir, that is less than a kilogram of coffee, was also procured, which means that very small ryots were also taking part in this, relationship with Parry's. And initially, the Parry's contract had a beneficial impact on coffee cultivation. We are told that there was expansion of cultivation, expansion of varam that was being collected. And this virtual monopoly, like I stated earlier, was helped to the rahadari system. And this rahadari system or the pass system was that a pass had to be issued by Parry's or their agent. No coffee could be taken out of the coffee producing taluks unless it was covered by Parry's pass. And this was done to ensure that the full delivery of crop was made to Parry's and to curb coffee smuggling. And Parry's contract, which was initially for 10 years, was renewed in 1832-33 again. And taking advantage of this prolonged monopoly, we see that the company reduced the price at which they would procure coffee from the ryots from rupees 4 to rupees 3 per mond, which did not go down very well with the peasants. Apart from this, the restrictive pass system was sought to be renewed all again and imposed on the peasants. in order to ensure that there was no coffee smuggling, and a penalty was also imposed. And the agents of the company were also accused of underweighing the coffee crop which was being supplied to them. And this underweighing would have meant that the relationship of dominance and the relationship of financial control which was being exercised could not be shaken off very, very easily by the peasants. And in 1835, we come across the fact that the local agents of the company asked for official help in procurement of coffee produced from the coffee producing taluks, which meant that the peasants were not ready to supply coffee to them at, at the given rate. And it is also indicative of the fact that there was large-scale smuggling of coffee going on, and the peasants were not ready to give, coffee to the company, despite the fact that they had taken advances to supply it to them at the rates. And we see that this Paris contract was becoming unpopular with the peasants, and the peasants accused the Paris agent of taking advantage of this relationship and how they had fallen, and I'm quoting, unavoidably and hopelessly in debt in many cases. And there were also accusations of exactions and fraud against the company by the ryots. And we get to know that, the rates at which coffee was being procured by Paris agents was actually going down, and how the Gaudas, or the dominant peasants and the village headmen, were hesitant to expand coffee cultivation in 1835 and 36. And we see that other traders, both Indian as well as foreign, wanted to procure coffee from the coffee producing taluks, which they were not being allowed to do because of the restrictive contract and the pass system. And there were accusations and counter-accusations between the agents of Paris and other merchants regarding whether, they could take out coffee from the taluks or not. And herein comes the role of the British administration. We see that the British administration took keen interest in encouraging coffee cultivation in Mysore, and extension of coffee plantations was considered by Commissioner Cubbon to be a matter of great importance for the prosperity of Mysore. And the British tax policy was related to the interlinked goals of encouraging coffee cultivation, augmenting state revenue, and general development of the Malnad region. By the mid-1830s, the British administration did not favor crop sharing or batai or revenue farming, with their attendant problems of declining revenue with declining prices, the problems of weighing of the crop, and oppression of the ryots. Apart from this, there was a good amount of debate amongst the British officials regarding how coffee cultivation could be encouraged. And they were coming to the conclusion that it could not be encouraged under this heavy varam, in which half of the produce was taken as tax, and the restrictive contract system, and the virtual monopoly that had been established by the renter. And we see that in December 1837, once the coffee contract of Paris expired, revenue farming was abolished, and the tax policy over coffee also changed from crop sharing, half of the crop sharing, to halat, or an excise duty of ₹1 per mond of 28 lbs of pounds of coffee exported or sold. And a potent reason for ending of the heavy varam and Paris ijaradari would have been to encourage European planters to settle down in the Malnad, because from 1838 we see the establishment of European plantations in Mysore, expansion of cultivation, increase of coffee prices, and halat returns. Okay.
Any questions?
Okay. See, as far as resistance to the peasants go, we get to know from the sources, and I have looked at official sources, that the peasants were quite unhappy with the extension of Paris contract. Initially, they were happy, and the agents were also popular with the local ryots, and then they were unhappy with them. Apart from that, I haven't come across any resistance as such, apart from the fact that at the local level, the superintendents of the divisions in Nagar and Ashtagram, they were aware of the fact that the contract was becoming unpopular. And the Mysore Maharaja was there, But the Mysore Maharaja, you know, was under the control of the British administration, and in 1831 October, from 1831 October to July 1881, Mysore is under direct British administration, and the second coffee contract of 5 years is given to Paris under the British administration by Mark Cubbon. But we see that the British were interested in. Okay, that's
Got
it.
that point. Any other question? Just 2 points that I wanted to make. One
Yeah.
is Buchanan, he wasn't Buchanan Hamilton at that time.
He was Francis
Francis
Buchanan,
Buchanan.
yes.
Okay,
Yeah.
when he's there. Second thing, it has something to do with the price decline, the depression.
You know, in
have
18th,
mentioned,
yeah, just a minute. You know, in 1831 there is a Nagar rebellion, and if we look at the data that is available to us, we see that there is decline in the in procurement of coffee and in Varam. And in 1833 there is a depression, you know, all over India because of what is happening in Europe. So we do see a decline, you know, in the collections. But if we look at you know, tax collections from coffee, then there is always a variation. Always a variation.
It could be that when prices are going up, they are happy to expand initially.
No, but what I have argued in my paper is that when there is renewal in 1832, they utilized the prolonged monopoly that they were enjoying to reduce the procurement price, and the peasants could not do much because they were heavily indebted to Paris. So their freedom to operate was not enough, and that is why I have called this paper From Monopoly to Free Trade. From one monopoly player, there's going to be, you know, with the ending of the monopoly, there are going to be new buyers, and this is going to increase the prices for the ryots. And this is going to also expand coffee cultivation, because that was the logic that the British administration was following in Mysore at that time. I mean, if you look at the combination of factors.
Thank you. I have to give you this. Next is Kamal Singh. Is Kamal Singh here? After Kamal Singh is not here. Umar Majid. After Umar Majid, please come. Yes, next is Majid here? Majid P. Is Majid P here? No. Madhulika Singh. Safir Ahmed Bhatt.
Ask him positively to come up at lunch.
Respected teacher, respected chairperson and other delegates, good afternoon everyone. And the title of my paper is Kashmir, an Oriental Landscape Through the Eyes of European Travelers. Through the accounts of European travelers, the image of Kashmir specifically as an Oriental landscape over an era extended between the 17th and mid-19th century. In general, we can say that the statement regarding travel texts of the time under focus is that travel literature was in a progressive stage for being a cherished source of knowledge and curious information and many other novel attributes. Among the contribution of both these passing date towards the genre of travels was an expected thing. Owing to the extensive development of European expansion and imperialism, constantly growing travel records borrowed from and in turn nourishing the images of the East and its inhabitants subsequently collided with colonizing efforts of the time. The travelers encountering the East even sometimes proved an instrument in giving a lease of life to the imperial construction. The purpose of this paper is to give details about their political interest and how the European travel writing on Kashmir, with its own needs and demands to fulfill, have shaped various notions about the Kashmir Valley. The Oriental lands of which Kashmir was a necessary constant figure from the 17th century onwards seemed much closer to Europe. There was a rudimentary idea that would exist to haunt the people of multiple tastes and professions towards the valley. The extensive development in the magnitude of trade ventures and European companies that in the days to come would pay way for the rise of their imperialism gave birth to the process of cultural and cartographic representation of different zones of the world, including Kashmir Valley.
What is
Have you
our-
given a copy of the paper?
There is no copy. Okay, what is your
Okay,
copy?
okay, we'll let him continue.
Please continue.
Conceived as the primary eyewitness and even based on observation echoing dramatic situation of personal encounters of European traveler in the foreign lands, travel narratives fascinatingly enjoyed wide popularity over a long span of time. The travel narratives as the representatives of the East were much more than simple geographical description. According to Michael Harrigan, he says that they were also planned to divert, to entertain through accounts of dramatic situations, monstrous events, and unsolicited people encountered by the travelers. So, Kashmir Valley as a travel-proof center to various travel accounts maintained by European travelers emerged at a time when travel narrations were considered very much a bearer of new knowledge and information from a world which remained in large part unknown and which evidently awaited a receptive European public. Located in the east, almost akin to the other regions of east, it generated varying amounts of information depending on the level of contact European and British travelers maintaining with the region. This is comprising a Kashmir, and therefore it was presented to the European audience through the travel narratives for a significant period, till it finally came under Western imperial domination. As an oriental landscape, Kashmir was a host of exotic land surfaces with the people of divergent kinds, their different traditions, culture, and religious beliefs, and ultimately the most diverse identities.
Conclusion.
Okay, sir. Conclude.
Conclusion. What are your?
So the conclusion is like the travel writing on Kashmir constitutes a substantial portion of European travel writing on Oriental lands and central to such a vast body of textual depiction of a region. Multiple interests of empire, the dynamic role of travelers, travel intentions, and clash of diverse interests were involved. The travel narratives emerged a picture of East which had to meet the twin requirements of faithful transcription and the interest of readership, for which they even compressed with the actual and observer reality. The valley of Kashmir proper stood on the known routes in the high mountains of Karakoram and trade routes into Central Asia, and so became a staging point for all expeditions intent on exploring the inner sanctum of the mountains or venturing beyond into Central Asia. These later narratives encompass a host of motivations, but all are constructed against the state activities depicted in the majority of travel narratives on Kashmir. Gradually, the strategic importance of Kashmir to the British became evident, and travel writing beyond the veil assumed a political dimension. Likewise, as European travelers explored its strategic importance to serve as scientific boundary term, it religiously backward and keenly awaited for reorganization excessively exotic and nostalgic that they need to visit. Therefore, most of the travel accounts explain Kashmir region for the imperial viewpoint, and thus on the path of travelers, travel and travel accounts of Europeans began to echo like to the voice of English imperialism, and their encounter with Kashmir was on behalf of the empire. Though all these imperial concerns have rendered the travel texts of European travelers who choose to inscribe and represent Kashmir.
Thank you. Any questions?
Please give a copy of your paper here.
Any questions, comments? Thank you. We will break after this. We'll break for lunch, and after lunch we at 2:30. He's saying sharp. At 2:30 sharp, we will assemble in, what's it called, the academic halls. And I hope that the audience will be there in the academic halls also, in the session after lunch. Thank you.
G29 and F48. G29 and F48 from what it is.
Okay.
230 from 230, there will be two places. G29 and F48.
G for golf. G29 and F48.
So there is one session. Earlier played is saying there is no two sessions, only one.
Okay.
You just said to G29.
Let's see.
Oh,
how
let's
many
see.
there are.
Where you take the
No, I have that. I have to look through my black note. Huh? Yes, that's what.
Yes.
We can. That's true.
Yeah, that's true.
Uh,
Yes.